They always begin these operations the same way, from the sky, from a distance, from a place where consequences don't linger. A strike is announced, coordinates are released, a statement follows, carefully worded, deliberately calm. Targets neutralized, mission successful. And just like that, the story is supposed to end. But in northern Nigeria, that's never where the story actually begins. When US airstrikes ordered under Donald Trump hit Nigerian territory, the official framing was immediate and confident. This was presented as decisive action against insurgents linked to the Islamic State. A demonstration of American reach, a reminder that Washington still had the ability and the will to act in Africa. On paper it looked clean, efficient, controlled. On the ground it landed very differently. Because Nigeria is not short on explosions. It is short on security. For the civilians living beneath those flight paths, airstrikes are not an event, they are a pattern. They have learned to read with unsettling accuracy. Jets arrive, drones pass overhead, noise replaces silence, then the sky clears, and nothing else changes. No permanent patrols appear, no roads suddenly become safe, no villages gain protection once the aircraft leave. And that's the first crack in the official narrative. If air power were enough to stabilise northern Nigeria, this conflict would have ended years ago. Nigerian aircraft have carried out countless missions. Camps have been hit. Leaders have been killed. Statements have been issued over and over again. Yet the violence never disappears. It mutates. It shifts locations. It fragments into smaller cells. It spreads into areas that were once considered marginal. And each time the same response is recycled. Strike from above. What's missing from that story is the context leaders rarely discuss. Armed groups in northern Nigeria didn't emerge because the sky was too quiet. They emerged because the ground was ungoverned, police stations understaffed, military deployments temporary, roads abandoned to bandits, entire communities left to negotiate survival without a reliable state presence. In those conditions, armed groups don't need to conquer territory. They simply occupy absence. Airstrikes don't fill that absence. They don't guard villages at night. They don't escort traders along unsafe highways. They don't stop kidnappings carried out days or weeks later. They destroy targets, but they don't protect people. And that distinction matters. Because when US officials announced these strikes, there was no accompanying explanation of what would happen next. No plan outlined for civilian protection. No discussion of retaliation risks. No commitment to sustained security once the aircraft returned home. The story stopped at impact. That tells you who the story was written for. These announcements aren't designed for farmers deciding whether it's safe to work their fields tomorrow. They're not written for families listening for engines after dark. They're crafted for audiences far away. Voters, media outlets, political rivals. People who consume security as a headline rather than a lived condition. For them, destruction looks like progress. For Nigerians on the ground, destruction without follow-through looks like exposure. Because armed groups don't respond to airstrikes the way conventional armies do. They don't collapse. They disperse. They blend back into terrain and communities. They wait. And when foreign attention fades, as it always does, they return quietly, asking questions civilians never volunteered to answer. This is why measuring success by targets hit misses the point entirely. Security isn't about what's destroyed in a single night. It's about what remains protected months later. And on that measure, these strikes didn't change the balance. They reinforced a familiar pattern. Power, applied briefly from above, responsibility abandoned below, which leads to the uncomfortable question no official statement addressed. Not directly, not honestly. If these strikes weren't designed to change life on the ground, what were they actually meant to achieve? That's where the story is really headed. To understand why airstrikes fail to deliver real security in northern Nigeria, you have to understand how these conflicts actually function. Not on briefing slides, not in press conferences, but in the daily mechanics of fear, movement, and survival. Militant groups in this region are not static formations. They are not sitting inside permanent bases, waiting to be eliminated. They are adaptive networks, mobile, decentralized, built to survive pressure, not collapse under it. When bombs fall, they don't fight back from the air. They vanish. Camps are abandoned before impact. Fighters disperse into forests, villages, border regions. Weapons are hidden. Command structures fracture temporarily, then reassemble somewhere else. What gets destroyed is infrastructure, not influence. And influence is the real currency of these groups. They control roads through fear. They control communities through intimidation. They control economies through kidnapping, extortion, and smuggling. None of that requires a fixed location. None of it is neutralized by a crater in the ground. This is why the aftermath matters more than the strike itself. After the smoke clears, civilians are left in a more dangerous position than before. Areas near strike zones become marked. Militants don't need proof of cooperation. Suspicion is enough. Villages become warnings. Movement becomes risk. Silence becomes survival. This is the phase no announcement ever mentions because it can't be framed as success. Markets thin out. Children stop attending school. Farmers abandon land because working openly becomes an invitation for punishment. Roads empty not because they are safe, but because everyone knows they are not. Security in practice has collapsed further, not improved, and the state response rarely follows. Permanent patrols don't arrive. Infrastructure isn't rebuilt. Civilian protection doesn't scale up. The airstrike becomes a lone gesture, disconnected from any sustained presence on the ground, which tells armed groups something important. They learn that attention is temporary, that power arrives loudly and leaves quickly, that civilians will be left alone once the headlines fade. That knowledge strengthens them, because control doesn't require constant violence, it requires predictability. And these cycles, violence, airstrike, silence, are predictable. This is why civilians don't measure safety by casualty numbers released by governments. They measure it by freedom of movement, by whether they can travel after sunset, by whether a checkpoint protects or extorts them, by whether tomorrow looks more dangerous than yesterday. On those measures, nothing improved. In some cases, it worsened. And yet, despite this track record, leaders keep returning to airstrikes as the primary response. Not because evidence supports them, but because they are politically convenient. Airstrikes create the appearance of control without demanding structural change. They don't require confronting corruption within security forces. They don't require long deployments in hostile terrain. They don't require explaining why police stations were abandoned or why intelligence networks failed. They bypass accountability. A jet in the sky becomes a substitute for governance on the ground. Instead of fixing why armed groups operate freely, officials announce that armed groups were hit. Instead of admitting systemic failure, they point to explosions. Instead of protecting civilians before violence happens, they react afterward and call it success. This isn't strategy, it's optics, and optics matter, especially to foreign leaders. For Washington, these strikes fit neatly into domestic political narratives. They signal toughness. They show reach. They reduce a complex African security crisis into a single, exportable claim. Action was taken. No need to explain Nigeria's internal fractures. No need to discuss decades of neglect, broken trust, or local power dynamics. Those details don't travel well. Explosions do. That's why airstrikes are framed as decisive moments, even when history shows they rarely are. They produce clean numbers, dramatic visuals, and short news cycles. All things that satisfy distant audiences. But security isn't built for audiences. It's built for people who don't have the option to look away. And for those people, this pattern isn't reassuring. It's familiar. And familiarity, in this context, means danger. Because they know what comes next. The attention will move on. And they will remain. This is where the gap between external narratives and local reality becomes impossible to ignore. Because once the airstrikes fade from the news cycle, civilians don't return to normal life. They enter the most dangerous phase of all, the quiet aftermath. This is the part no briefing slide can capture. Armed groups rarely respond immediately. They wait. They observe patterns. They track who left, who stayed, who spoke to whom. Retaliation isn't loud, it's deliberate. A village becomes a message. A family becomes an example. Cooperation, real or imagined, is punished not to extract information, but to restore fear. And fear is how control is maintained. This is why airstrikes often strengthen insurgent influence instead of weakening it. Not because militants gain military advantage, but because civilians become more cautious, more isolated, and more dependent on whatever power is present after the state withdraws again. When protection is temporary, neutrality disappears. People adapt not to ideology but to survival. They comply because compliance reduces risk. They stay silent because silence is safer than being noticed. Outsiders mistake this for support. It's not. It's a calculation forced by abandonment. And the abandonment is structural. After strikes, there is rarely a surge in permanent security forces. No consistent patrols, no rebuilt police posts, no sustained intelligence presence rooted in trust. In some areas, there is nothing at all, just absence. That absence tells civilians everything they need to know. It tells them that protection arrives from the sky, briefly, and leaves before consequences unfold. It tells them that once attention moves on, they are expected to absorb the fallout quietly. This is why many Nigerians don't see airstrikes as reassurance. They see them as warning signals, because attention without commitment is dangerous. And this brings us to a deeper issue, one that goes beyond tactics or military capability. These strikes are not designed around Nigerian realities. They are designed around external expectations. They are meant to be seen. For foreign audiences, the narrative is simple. A threat was identified, action was taken, force was applied, end of story. That framing works thousands of miles away. It collapses on contact with the ground. Because Nigeria's security crisis is not a single threat. It's a layered failure. Criminal economies, land disputes, ethnic tensions, corruption, weak governance, decades of mistrust between communities and the state. None of that can be resolved by air power, and none of it fits neatly into a press release. So instead, the conflict is reduced, simplified, packaged. Nigeria becomes a backdrop, not the subject. Its people become context, not the priority. This is where sovereignty becomes complicated. Yes, cooperation may be approved. Yes, coordination may be confirmed. But when security logic is shaped to satisfy foreign political cycles, rather than local protection needs, sovereignty becomes procedural, not practical. Decisions are made to look decisive abroad, even if they increase risk at home. If Nigerian civilians were the primary audience for these strikes, the messaging would look very different. It would include protection plans. It would address retaliation risks. It would explain how safety would be sustained after the aircraft left. Instead, the story ends at impact, and silence follows. Silence about follow-up, silence about accountability, silence about who is responsible when armed groups return. That silence is not accidental. It reflects priorities. Security policy that speaks loudly to outsiders and quietly to locals tells you exactly who it is meant to impress. And it isn't the farmer deciding whether to travel tomorrow. It isn't the trader calculating which road won't get them kidnapped. It isn't the family listening for engines after dark. Which leads directly to the question that can no longer be postponed. Once the cameras are gone and the statements are archived, what actually happens to the people left behind? Because that answer determines whether these strikes were about protection or performance. Once the attention fades, civilians are left with something far heavier than silence. They are left with consequences. This is the phase that never appears in official summaries because it cannot be counted, confirmed, or celebrated. There are no numbers for fear, no metrics for suspicion, no statements issued when armed men return quietly and ask questions no one wants to answer. But this is when the real damage sets in. After airstrikes, armed groups don't need to reassert control loudly. They already understand the terrain. They know who lives where, they know which communities were nearby, and they know the state is gone again. So punishment becomes selective, symbolic, effective. A single attack is enough to reshape behaviour across an entire region. Villages don't need to be destroyed, they just need to be reminded. Cooperation becomes unthinkable. Movement becomes restricted. Trust evaporates. What looks like calm from above is, on the ground, controlled paralysis. Markets operate at half strength. Roads empty early. Children stay home. Farming slows. Local economies shrink under invisible pressure. Life doesn't explode, it contracts. And none of that shows up in airstrike assessments. Because the metric being used is wrong. Success is being measured by damage inflicted, not danger reduced. By force displayed, not safety created. by action taken, not responsibility sustained. This is why the same cycle keeps repeating. Violence rises. Leaders react from the air. Statements are issued. Attention fades. Armed groups adapt. Civilians absorb the cost. Nothing structural changes because nothing structural is being targeted. Airstrikes operate above the problem, literally and politically. They allow leaders to look decisive in situations where real control is absent. They create movement without direction, activity without resolution, and that's their true function. These operations are not designed to end Nigeria's insecurity. They are designed to manage perception, to reassure distant audiences that something is being done, while avoiding the harder, riskier work of fixing what's broken on the ground. Real security would require permanent presence, protected roads, accountable forces, rebuilt trust. It would require admitting failure before declaring progress. That work is slow, expensive, politically dangerous. Airstrikes bypass all of it. They turn insecurity into spectacle. They convert complex local crises into clean foreign narratives. They offer leaders control over the story, even when they lack control over reality. And that leaves Nigerians with the same unresolved truth they had before the jets arrived. Safety is still uncertain. Protection is still temporary. And survival is still negotiated daily, without guarantees. So the question isn't whether these strikes were legal, coordinated, or tactically impressive. The question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. How many times will security be measured by explosions in the sky instead of safety on the ground? Because until that answer changes, the cycle will continue, and the people beneath it will keep paying the price.